Chapter 1. We thought we were prepared. Pine Bluff was where we wanted to raise our children. The Brewers had moved there first and told us how they enjoyed the ward and how well they had been accepted into the community. Tom was a computer geek and had found work throughout the community as Mr. Fix-It with electronics. He hadn't earned as much as he had in Los Angeles, but he said the move into the small Utah community was ideal for his family and that his trade-off in lower income had been an adjustment that all the family had readily accepted. Tom and Sally had been so pumped about their new home that Mona and I began to have those same yearnings for small-town life. We visited them in Pine Bluff with our children, Polly, Spencer, and Brig, and it was as if we had pulled a curtain to the little house on the prairie. Our 9-year-old, Brig, immediately made friends with Ian Burgess and said that he never wanted to leave Pine Bluff. Polly and Spencer, although not making instant friends, but feeling comfortable with the Brewers, felt like they were home again. And Mona, anyone would have thought that she had returned home after a bivouac in enemy territory. It didn't take long for us to make the same decision that Tom and Sally had made. It was easier for me to leave LA because my website design business was primarily from my home, and I could take care of it as well from Pine Bluff as from the city. Because of a declining real estate market, we were forced to sell our home for less than we wanted. But when we looked around Pine Bluff, we found that homes with the same amenities in Los Angeles were selling for less money, so we felt that our move had not set us back financially. Looking back, our new lives in the little Utah town were so fresh and so full of new adventure that we felt that we were finally home. Mona had been quickly called by the bishop to serve as the Beehive advisor, and I was called to be the new scoutmaster, a position that I had held in Los Angeles. It seemed as if we were instantly a part of the community. Brig and Ian were inseparable. Polly, although missing some of the frills and fads that her LA friends had shared with her, had new friends that she found she had more in common with, and Spencer was immersed in scouting and middle school sports. Our family was a picture from a Hallmark movie. Everything seemed perfect. I remember too well how things changed. Tom and I had talked about last day's things before and had gone through the what-ifs of certain possibilities. Both of us were concerned about the chemtrails we had seen in the skies, and we would point them out to each other. When either of us would see new things online about potential future problems, we would talk about them. Tom and Sally were both into food storage, but probably not as much as Mona and I were. Then everything changed, and all of our talk and philosophizing seemed meaningless. We had talked about an electromagnetic pulse before, but it seemed so remote that we didn't give too much thought to it. Besides, everything that both of us had read seemed to reinforce that there was really no preparation that could be made. Our conversation about EMP still rings in my mind. Tom was skeptical, and I really didn't understand much about it. It says sun explosions or aerial nuclear weapons could stop all cars and electricity. I can't imagine that our government wouldn't have some kind of defense for that. I think that's more of that right-wing scaremongering. Interesting, but not very probable. Don't you think that we ought to plan for a time when the power is out? Sure, but that'll only be temporary. You think that our food storage is enough? Well, if something comes up and we need more than food storage, the church will let us know. When it happened, we seemed so helpless. My earlier conversation with Tom had been passed off as a mere what-if. That didn't seem overly important at the time, but things became much worse. The news stories were mixed about what happened. Some reports said that Iran launched several EMP missiles at strategic aerial sites across the United States, and other reports linked North Korea, China, and Russia as having also contributed in the attack. Initially, it seemed to be a real nuisance and a hindrance to our normal routines. The EMP, just as earlier reports had said that it would, immediately killed our cars and all of our electricity in our home. One of the tragic consequences that we later heard about was that the EMP also affected all aircraft electronics, causing thousands of airborne planes to lose power and crash. For us, the after effects of the blast were kind of an adventure. The school administration had thought they were prepared for power failure because of school emergency generators, but even these were destroyed by the EMP. Students were all dismissed from school, and along with their school books were given the admonition to keep reading until school would resume. Most of us thought that the power outage and electronic disturbance was local, that it had only affected Pine Bluff and perhaps the immediate surrounding area. We couldn't get word out to other neighboring communities and cities, so we waited to hear from them. It was a strange feeling of isolation. Because our ward covered quite a distance and our chapel was about 4 miles from our home, we weren't sure how to go about getting together with the other ward members. We couldn't telephone each other, nor could we drive our cars to homes to check on each other. And finally, a couple days after the EMP, Bishop Walker came to our home on his son's bicycle. I had borrowed Briggs' bike for a few short runs to our local grocery and to visit Tom and Sally, but knew that I didn't want to use the bicycle for long distances. When I saw Bishop Walker pedaling up our driveway, it finally hit me that transportation would take a completely different turn than anything that I had been used to before. The news from Bishop Walker was reassuring, while simultaneously discouraging. We were assured that all members of the ward that he had visited were doing well, and that everyone felt they could get by for a while. We had a few people in our ward that daily commuted to Beaver or Cedar City for employment, but most ward members worked for themselves or were employed locally. Most had heeded the warnings to store food and water, although the bishop said that a few families had a minimal food supply. He mentioned the Barkers and the Pallants specifically, and he asked, because the Barkers lived just around the corner from us, if we could share some of our food with them. Then he explained the scope of what had happened. He said that Brother Kelly was our ward communications specialist, and that he had spent most of the day before with him receiving shortwave messages from Salt Lake and from our stake president about the extent of the EMP damage and our immediate course of action. For the first time, we learned that the EMP effects were nationwide and included parts of Canada and Mexico, and that all the cities and transportation were effectively shut down. We learned that, at least for a while, there would be no further deliveries to our little grocery store, as well as the other stores in town, and that we would need to be self-sufficient until other services could be restored. A specific problem that he told us about was our water. Because water storage was in the hills above, our water is gravity flow into Pine Bluff, a situation which many of the surrounding towns did not enjoy. When the level of water fell to a certain point, a pump filled the underground cistern that then flowed to the various homes in town. Our problem, of course, was that the water level was quickly being drawn to the point where the pump would need to refill the underground cistern, and the pump was inoperable. He told us that Brother Sage, the high priest group leader, would probably come by the next day or two with a plan for the men in the ward to hike to the reservoir and manually fill the cistern. Thank heavens for the ward organization and the communication that we did have. I'm afraid that without it, we would have been completely in the dark. Then, with the realization that the effect of the EMP was widespread, Mona and I did some worrisome talking. Mona's parents still lived in Los Angeles and were quite dependent on electricity. Her mother to operate a sleep apnea respirator for night breathing, and her father used a respirator for increased oxygen inhalation. Although concerned and worried, we were unable to help them or even to communicate in some way to know how they were. From that time, our prayers took on much more personal meaning. We had intense concern for Mona's parents in Los Angeles, as well as mine in Salt Lake City. We had friends in Los Angeles and in various places throughout the West. In fact, it seemed as though we had friends scattered everywhere. We had never really thought about distance as a hindrance to relationships before, but now distance was everything. Our prayers voiced concern for people that we couldn't do anything for. Our trust became greater in God because He was the only one that we could turn to. Still, life was not as difficult as many of the prophets of doom has told us it would be. It was summer and our homes were warm, and with a little work we had water. Our food supply seemed adequate, and frankly, our family was invigorated by the seemingly pioneer experience. But we couldn't foresee the future.